Welcome to the Daily News Currents. Today is Tuesday, March 18th, and for today's headlines we have: segregated facilities are no longer explicitly banned in federal contracts. Hundreds killed as Israel launches a series of airstrikes on Gaza. Hong Kong piles on to Beijing's growing criticism of Panama Canal deal. Elon Musk's Starlink expands across White House complex. Extermination camp found in Mexico. Group searching for the missing says. Segregated facilities are no longer explicitly banned in federal contracts. After a recent change by the Trump administration, the federal government no longer explicitly prohibits contractors from having segregated restaurants, waiting rooms, and drinking fountains. The segregation clause is one of several identified in a public memo issued by the General Services Administration last month, affecting all civil federal agencies. The memo explains that it is making changes prompted by President Trump's executive order on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which repealed an executive order signed by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965 regarding federal contractors and non-discrimination. The memo also addresses Trump's executive order on gender identity. While there are still state and federal laws that outlaw segregation and discrimination that companies need to comply with, legal experts say this change to contracts across the federal government is significant. It's symbolic, but it's incredibly meaningful to its symbolism, says Melissa Murray, a constitutional law professor at New York University. These provisions that require federal contractors to adhere to and comply with federal civil rights laws and to maintain integrated rather than segregated workplaces are all part of the federal government's efforts to facilitate the settlement that led to integration in the 1950s and 1960s. The fact that they are now excluding those provisions from the requirements for federal contractors, I think, speak volumes, Murray says. Deleted mentions of drinking fountains, transportation, and housing. The clause in question is in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, known as the FAR, and a huge document used by agencies to write contracts for anyone providing goods or services to the federal government. Clause 52.22-21 of the FAR is titled Prohibition of Segregated Facilities, and reads, "The contractor agrees that it does not and will not maintain or provide for its employees any segregated facilities at any of its establishments, and it does not and will not permit its employees to perform their services at any location under its control where segregated facilities are maintained." It defines segregated facilities as work areas, restaurants, drinking fountains, transportation, housing, and more, and it says you can't segregate based on race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or national origin. Several federal agencies, including the Department of Defense, Commerce, and Homeland Security, have notified staff who oversee federal contracts that they should start instituting these changes. A recent notice from the National Institute of Health shows that the change is already in effect. The notice regarding a maintenance agreement for scientific freeze dryers cites the GSA memo and reads, FAR 52.222-21, Prohibition of Segregated Facilities, and FAR 52.222-26, Equal Opportunity, will not be considered when making award decisions or enforce requirements. To be clear, all businesses, those that have government contracts and those that do not, still need to follow federal and state laws, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which makes segregated facilities illegal. In effect immediately. One federal worker who works on contracts said they were shocked when they received notice about the FAR changes from their agency. NPR has agreed not to identify the worker because they fear of being fired for speaking to the media without authorization. They said that the notice used to institute these changes without a typical public notice or comment period of 45 to 90 days is usually reserved for national emergencies. The way they're implementing this in the contracting field is essentially subverting democracy. You're supposed to allow agencies to comment on this, contracting officers to comment on it, and think through the implications carefully, the worker says. By doing this, they're essentially ramming things through, hoping no one's going to notice. The General Services Administration did not answer NPR's question about why the agency did not follow the usual public notice and comment procedure, or question why segregated facilities clause was removed. In a statement, GSA spokesperson Will Powell wrote, GSA has taken immediate action to fully implement all current executive orders and is committed to taking action to implement any new executive orders. Recent history. Cara Saliciato, an attorney at the Wiley firm in Washington, D.C., which specializes in federal contracts, speculates that the provision was flagged because it was revised under the Obama administration to include gender identity. That change was made, she says, to implement an Obama-era Executive Order 1367-2, and that executive order from the Obama administration is one of the ones that President Trump in his second term rescinded, she explains. And so, along with Trump's other executive orders about gender identification, I would suspect that that is the reason why this one got identified on the list. The memo does not say to exclude just the gender identity part of the clause, however. It says to exclude the whole thing. Murray, the law professor, says racial segregation is not as far away in history as it may seem. She remembers a trip to Washington, D.C. in 1985 when her father, a Jamaican immigrant, took her to Woodward in Lothrop, a department store where he had worked when he had been a student at Howard University. She thought he had been a salesman at the store, which closed in 1995. He's like, no. I only worked in the back because black people weren't allowed to be on the sales floor, she recalls. When it comes to segregation in America, she says, it's not far removed at all. Hundreds killed in Israel launches a series of airstrikes on Gaza. Gaza City, Gaza, and Tel Aviv, Israel. Israel launched a surprise wave of overnight strikes in Gaza early Tuesday, killing more than 410 people and injuring hundreds more, according to Gaza health officials, and raising the prospect of a full resumption of war after nearly 2-month ceasefire. Israel Defense Minister Israel Katz said the attacks targeted Hamas and launched because the group was refusing to release more hostages captured in the October 7, 2023 attack on Israel. The Israel strikes come hours after Israel negotiators returned from a round of talks in Egypt, aimed at reaching a new deal for releasing hostages and jump-starting discussions on permanent end of war. If Hamas does not release all the hostages, the gates of hell will open in Gaza, Katz said in a statement. Hamas said 4 of its senior officials, serving mid-level leadership roles in the Hamas-run government in Gaza, were killed in the strikes, along with their families. Israel is focusing on mid-ranking militant commanders and leadership officials to degrade Hamas' ability to build up its forces and rearm, according to an Israeli official who did not have authorization to speak publicly and spoke on condition of anonymity. At Al-Ayi Hospital in Gaza City, scores of bodies were laid out in the hospital courtyard. A man cradled a body of his 2-year-old daughter in a pink t-shirt with the word love written on it, trying to open her eyes. We've never expected a war to return, said Ibrahim Deeb, who said 35 members of his family were killed in the strike on their home in a neighborhood in Gaza City. Hamas and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government had decided to overturn the ceasefire agreement and said it was exposing Israel hostages to Gaza to an unknown fate. The group representing the families of Israeli hostages called on supporters to rally in Jerusalem in protest, accusing the Israeli government of endangering the hostages. Israel says 24 hostages are still being held alive and that Hamas is also holding the bodies of 35 hostages. Netanyahu decided to murder our hostages, wrote Inav Tiskujar, the mother of a hostage in Gaza and a vocal critic of the Israeli Prime Minister, in a Facebook group. Israel says it approved the surprise plan last weekend. White House spokeswoman Caroline Leavitt told Fox News that the Trump administration had been consulted by the Israelis about the strikes. As President Trump has made clear, Hamas, the Houthis, Iran, all those who seek to terrorize not just Israel but also the United States of America will see a price to pay. All hell will break loose, Leavitt said. For weeks, Israeli officials have been publicly warning that they're preparing plans to resume war in Gaza should ceasefire talks break down. The latest assault plans were presented by Israeli military officers to the government over the past weekend, Netanyahu's office said. In a statement posted on social media, the Israeli military ordered Palestinian residents from several neighborhoods to evacuate immediately, saying that Israel has launched a strong offensive against terrorist organizations. Mediators were still working on a ceasefire proposal. In mid-January, Israel and Hamas agreed to an initial phase of 6 weeks in which Hamas released 33 of its hostages, both living and dead. In return, Israel released close to 2,000 Palestinian prisoners and detainees who had been held in Israeli prisons. That phase ended at the beginning of March, but the second phase, in which talks designed to end the war were begun to do, did not start because Israel demanded more hostages be released before entering end-of-war talks. Israel began blocking food, fuel, electricity, aid, and medical supplies to Gaza to pressure Hamas to accept. The blockade has continued, is entering its 3rd week. Last week, President Trump's Midwest envoy, Steve Witkoff, proposed that Hamas would release around half of the remaining hostages in exchange for an extension of the ceasefire and a resumption of aid to Gaza, which during which talks would start for a permanent end of war. Hamas said it would release one dual American-Israeli hostage if talks for the permanent end of war began immediately. A hospital in Gaza City is flooded with bodies, including young children. In Gaza City in the north, families carried the bodies of the dead and wounded, many wrapped in winter blankets to shield them from the cold, to Al-Ali Hospital, the only fully functional hospital in the north. In the courtyard of the hospital, the scene was heavy and chaotic, with bodies covering the floor and relatives weeping over them. Some families said they pulled the bodies out of the rubble and drove them to the hospital morgue. Some were rushing to drive the bodies of the relatives to the cemetery to bury them. Many said they were shocked by the sudden and violent return of war. Suleiman Gradga said he was asleep with his wife in the nearby Shia neighborhood when they awoke to the sound of shelling in the area. He said he thought it was a bad dream at first. Then an airstrike hit the house next door, which he said was full of his family members, and was destroyed. He thinks more than a dozen of his family members were killed. I expected the ceasefire to continue and for things to get better, and we had this surprise, he said. We have no family anymore. We've become extinct. He begged for the world to intervene. Hong Kong piles on to Beijing's growing criticism of Panama Canal deal. The city's chief executive said a deal between the Hong Kong conglomerate C.K. Hutchinson and BlackRock, a major American investment firm, requires serious attention. Political pressure is mounting over a plan by Hong Kong conglomerate to sell its Panama ports to BlackRock, the American investor, raising questions about the future of the $19 billion deal. John Lee, the leader of Hong Kong, added his voice on Tuesday to escalating warnings from China, saying the transaction deserves serious attention. The deal between C.K. Hutchinson, one of Hong Kong's most successful conglomerates, and BlackRock, the world's biggest asset manager, was seen by investors as a solution to a geopolitical hot potato that began with a claim by President Trump that C.K. Hutchinson's ownership of two major ports on either end of the Panama Canal was an issue for national security because it was operated by China. Mr. Trump praised the BlackRock deal after it was announced. Now the solution is starting to look more like a problem. Shares in C.K. Hutchinson, which is controlled by one of Hong Kong's richest people, Li Ka-shing, fell nearly 3% on Tuesday after Mr. Lee's comments. The company has canceled press and investor briefings that were scheduled for this week, which releases its last financial report. Hutchinson does not respond to requests for comment. China has criticized the planned port deal, which would result in C.K. Hutchinson selling most of its Hutchinson port holdings, including its Panama ports, and over 40 other global ports. A series of commentaries pushed by Ta Kung Pao, a Hong Kong newspaper owned by the Hong Kong government and Communist Party, argued that the Hutchinson-BlackRock arrangement would allow the United States to use it for political purposes and promote its own political agenda, in turn making Chinese shipping and trade subject to the United States. On Tuesday, Hong Kong's Mr. Lee said that any transaction must comply with the legal and regulatory requirements. Speaking at a weekly press briefing, he said that the government would handle it in accordance with the law and regulations. He did not elaborate, but legal experts say that historically, mergers or acquisitions undertaken by Hong Kong companies and foreign ones have not had to seek the kind of regulatory approval Mr. Lee was potentially referring to. It is not clear what, if anything, the Hong Kong authorities could do to stop the deal. By contrast, Chinese companies often must secure permission from the Ministry of Commerce, the State Administration for Foreign Exchange, and other regulators to sell assets or move money out of mainland China. But the warnings have raised concerns among some of the financial community about the politicization of businesses in Hong Kong, a former British colony that was returned to Beijing in 1997 under the promise it would operate with a high degree of autonomy. This pledge changed in 2022 when Beijing imposed a national security law in the city to quash pro-democracy protests. While Mr. Lee's government has repeatedly emphasized that Hong Kong remains an open place to do business and global financial hub with laws separate from the rest of China, some critics have pointed out that this government is under pressure from Beijing. But amid rising animosity between the United States and China, and the global uncertainty caused by President Trump's trade policies, deal-making involving Hong Kong companies have become more politicized. The deal between C.K. Hutchinson and BlackRock can no longer be seen as purely commercial in nature, said Wang Zhengwei, associate professor of journalism at Hong Kong Baptist University. Let's do a reverse and say BlackRock announced it was going to sell its ports to Che Kong in Hong Kong, Mr. Wang said, referring to C.K. Hutchinson's former name. I would imagine that Trump would write angry tweets on Truth Social condemning the deal, he added. In Congress, I'm certain lawmakers would make noises and launch a congressional investigation to this deal, too. On Tuesday, Mr. Lee also added to the criticism from Beijing over the Trump administration's threats to tariffs, saying that Hong Kong's government urged other countries to provide a level playing field for companies. Using similar language to the Chinese government in its own statements on the subject, he added, "We oppose the abusive use of coercion or bullying tactics in international economic and trade relations." Elon Musk's Starlink expands across White House complex. Trump administration officials say the company donated the internet service, saying the gift had been vetted by the lawyer overseeing ethics issues in the White House counsel office. Starlink, a satellite internet service operated by Elon Musk's SpaceX, is now available across the White House campus. It is the latest installation of the Wi-Fi networks across the government since Mr. Musk joined the Trump administration as an unpaid advisor. It was not immediately clear when the White House complex was fitted with Starlink after President Trump took office for a second term. Starlink terminals, rectangular panels that receive internet signals beamed from SpaceX satellites in low Earth orbit, can be placed on physical structures. But instead of being physically placed at the White House, the Starlink system is now said to be routed through the White House data center, with existing fabric cables nosed from the complex. White House officials say the installation was an effort to increase internet availability at the complex. They said that some areas of the property could not get cell service and that the existing Wi-Fi infrastructure was overtaxed. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, said the effort was to improve Wi-Fi connectivity on the complex, but the circumstances are different from any previous situation to resolve internet services. Mr. Musk, who is now an unpaid advisor working as a special government employee at the White House, controls Starlink and other companies that have regulatory matters before or contracts with the federal government. Questions about his business interests conflicting with his status as a presidential advisor and major Trump donor have persisted for weeks. In February, Chris Stanley, who currently works as a security engineer at two of Mr. Musk's companies, SpaceX and the social media platform X, went to the roof of the Eisenhower Executive Office building in the White House complex to explore installing Starlink there. Mr. Stanley has also been working with Mr. Musk's Department of Government Efficiency as a special government employee. As Mr. Stanley opened a door leading to the roof of the building, which was directly opposite an entrance of the White House, he tripped an alarm that alerted the Secret Service to his presence. It created a dramatic scene as a uniformed officer rushed to respond, according to 4 people with knowledge of the incident. A 5th person with knowledge of the event said Mr. Stanley was told earlier by Secret Service that he could check out the roof, but the agency had not coordinated a time for Mr. Stanley's arrival. Harrison Fields, a White House spokesperson, said the White House was aware of DOJ's intentions to improve internet access on the campus, but it did not consider this matter a security incident or security breach. Anthony Gulagini, a Secret Service spokesman, said it was not considered a breach or a security incident. White House officials said Starlink had donated the service and that this gift had been vetted by a lawyer overseeing ethics issues in the White House counsel office. Some former officials were unclear about how such a donation could work. Claire Maturana, a former chief information officer at the White House during the Biden administration, said that typically people cannot simply give technology to the government. She said the White House chief information officer would need to sign off on a new system to ensure it was properly secured, as would the chief information officer at the General Services Administration. Mr. Stanley worked to set up the new Starlink system in concert with the White House Information Technology Office, which he is an advisor to while being assigned to work at the Justice Department, one of the people familiar with the matter said. The White House is the latest government property on which Starlink now operates. In recent weeks, Starlink was also set up at General Services Administration, which has served as a hub for Mr. Musk's government shrinking efforts, according to documents and people familiar with the service. While several federal agencies contract with Starlink, the satellite service is typically used to provide internet access in emergency situations and to remote locations not at federal buildings in Washington, which already have ample internet options. Starlink is generally seen as a reliable network. In October, the Federal Emergency Management Agency contracted with Starlink and distribute terminals for the service across North Carolina after Hurricane Helene hit the state. The service has also been crucial to Ukraine's defense against Russia, with SpaceX estimating to the Defense Department that it cost $400 million to support the effort over a 12-month period around 2022. It is less clear, however, that the Starlink internet service will significantly expand wireless internet capacity in buildings where fiber cables already provide access. It was also unclear if Starlink communications were encrypted. At a minimum, the system allows for a network separate from existing White House servers. People on the grounds are able to use keeping that data separate. It's super rare to install Starlink or another internet provider as a replacement for existing government infrastructure that has been vetted and secured, said Jake Williams, the vice president for research and development at Hunter Strategy, a cybersecurity consultant. I can't think of a time where I've heard of that. It introduces another attack point, Mr. Williams said, but why introduce that risk? One official with the knowledge of the discussions about installing Starlink at the White House, who was not authorized to speak publicly, said the Secret Service was concerned with the Starlink system might be piped through existing secure hardwiring at the White House that is used by Secret Service, as well as other federal agencies. The fact that the internet service is now working through a different data hub appears to have addressed that concern. At the Federal Service Administration, where the use of Starlink was reported earlier by NBC News, the service has been added to a list of apps approved for download on the agency's mobile devices. That list also included apps of two other Musk-led companies, X and Tesla, according to the document seen by New York Times. Only apps that meet GSA's security and privacy standards are allowed, an agency spokesman said in a statement. The agency declined to comment on the use of Starlink. Mr. Musk has expressed frustration at what he views as outdated technology in government and blazed ahead with an effort to modernize it. Soon after Mr. Trump was sworn in, Mr. Musk complained that a digital service known as Waves, which allowed the Secret Service to approve guests to enter the White House grounds, was clunky. Some White House officials shared that assessment. Mr. Musk tasked Mr. Stanley with fixing it, according to two people briefed on the matter. Mr. Giuliani, the Secret Service spokesman, said the agency collaborates closely with Mr. Musk's team, and as continuing discussions at the time, he added, no formal changes have been made to the White House visitor access system. Extermination camp found in Mexico. Group searching for the missing says. The authorities are investigating a discovery of cremation ovens, human remains, piles of shoes, and other personal effects at an abandoned ranch outside Guadalajara. A group of volunteers searching for missing relatives first received a tip last week about a mass grave hidden in western Mexico. When they arrived at the abandoned ranch outside La Estuezela, a small rural village outside Guadalajara in Jalisco state, they discovered 3 underground cremation ovens, burned human remains, and hundreds of bone shards and discarded personal items, along with figurines of Santa Muerte, the Holy Death. The Mexican authorities, who were notified of the grisly discovery, said in several statements that they found 96 shell casings of various calibers and metal gripping rings at the ranch. By last Friday, the discovery was dominating local newspapers and TV reports, and the search group was referring to the site as an extermination camp. It is unclear how many people died on the site. None of the remains have been identified. The authorities have yet to say who operated the camp, what crimes were committed there, and for how long. But this week, the State Attorney General's office took over the investigation at the request of President Claudia Sheinbaum. Photos taken by the authorities and the volunteer group, Searching Warriors of Jalisco, at an abandoned ranch showed more than 200 shoes piled together and heaps of other personal items, a blue summer dress, a small pink backpack, notebooks, pieces of underwear. More than 700 personal items were a chilling hint at the number of people who may have died there. A country seemingly inured to episodes of brutal violence from drug cartels, where clandestine graves emerge every month, the images shocked Mexicans and prompted outraged human rights groups to demand that the government put an end to the violence that has ravaged the nation for years. The number of victims that presumably could have been buried there is enormous, said Eduardo Guerrero, a security analyst based on Mexico City, and it resurfaced a nightmarish reminder that Mexico is plagued with mass graves. More than 120,000 people have been forcibly disappeared in Mexico since such record-keeping began in 1962, according to official data. Human rights groups and collectives of volunteers searching for their missing relatives have warned that the number could be higher. The discovery at the ranch site comes at a time when Ms. Sheinbaum faces intense pressure from President Trump to crack down on organized crime in order to avoid tariffs on exports to the United States and even possible U.S. military intervention to hunt down cartel members. Partly because Mr. Trump's threats, Ms. Sheinbaum has shifted security issues back to center stage on her agenda and has taken a more aggressive approach in fighting crime than her predecessor, experts and analysts say. But her government faces significant challenges as she tackles the powerful criminal groups that control large areas of the country. One of the most violent criminal organizations in Mexico, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which emerged in the early 2010s, is now a major producer and trafficker of synthetic drugs, particularly fentanyl and methamphetamine. The group, which operates in the state of Jalisco and across the country, has diversified into other criminal activities like illegal logging, human trafficking, and extortion. The authorities have said that the ranch could have been operated by a Jalisco cartel. The group's dominance, with its rapid expansion in recent years, have coincided with a growing number of homicides, forced disappearance, and discoveries of mass graves in Jalisco state. Indira Navarro, leader of Searching Warriors of Jalisco, which found the site, said in interviews with local news media this week that several people have contacted the group to say that they had been recruited and trained at the site in the use of weapons and torture techniques. But the ranch, they said, was also used as a killing site where criminals routinely disposed of their victims. Mr. Navarro, who could not be reached for comment, told the news outlets that, according to testimonies, young people from other states were recruited through false job offers posted on social media. Once they accepted the job, she said, they were summoned to a bus station in Guadalajara, the state capital, from there taken to the ranch. Ms. Navarro recounted how one young man had told her that the young recruits were at times forced to burn their victims as part of their training. If they objected to the orders of the trainers, the recruits were sometimes fed to wild animals like lions, she said. This is not a horror film. This is our reality. People should know about it, Ms. Navarro, whose brother went missing 9 years ago, said in an interview on a national radio station. The New York Times could not independently verify the accounts. The local authorities were familiar with the ranch, first locating it last September and finding weapons, shell casing, and bone fragments there, according to the official reports, but further investigations were stopped for reasons that were unclear. During the same inspection, officials found and rescued 2 people who had been kidnapped and held at the ranch, and also discovered a body wrapped in plastic. Why the authorities did not discover the pile of shoes, clothes, and burned remains then is unclear. The state attorney general, Salvador Gonzalez, has since told local news media that it has not been possible to search the entire ranch back in September because there was a lot of hectares in the area. Ms. Scheinbaum suggested during the news conference this week that the local authorities might be omissive to their initial investigation. The Attorney General is correct in stating that it's not credible that a situation of this nature would not have been known to authorities of the municipality and the state, she said. But the first thing we have to do is investigate. That is all for today. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye!